On a brisk Thursday morning in late March, the city of Brookridge stirred awake beneath a pale sky. The sun had barely made its full climb over the brownstone rooftops, and the sidewalks on High Street were just beginning to fill with the usual parade of commuters, joggers, and hurried baristas balancing trays of steaming drinks. The scent of fresh espresso hung in the air like a promise of something comforting and warm. Chief Sharon Daniels, dressed in simple jeans and a navy blue windbreaker, walked with measured strides toward her favorite downtown spot, 7 Pines Cafe. She had always liked the place, not because of its overpriced pastries or the pretentious chalkboard menu with words like sustainable and farm to cup scrawled in cursive, but because it sat halfway between precinct headquarters and City Hall. On mornings like this, after back-to-back budget meetings and phone calls that started before sunrise, a strong Americano and a quiet corner were what kept her from burning out entirely. But this morning, the cafe was different. As Sharon approached the glass doors, she noticed something subtle. The man ahead of her, wearing a Patagonia vest and slacks, barely got a nod from the barista when he entered. Yet he was met with a cheery, "Good morning," from the girl behind the counter. Another young woman with platinum hair and AirPods walked in right behind him and was immediately greeted and offered a drink suggestion. When Sharon opened the door and stepped inside, the warmth of the cafe didn't reach her. The barista looked at her, then looked away. No smile, no greeting, just silence. Sharon took her place at the back of the line, only 3 people in front of her. She scanned the room as she waited, catching glimpses of polished laptop screens, latte art, and expensive coats draped over chairs. The patrons were mostly young professionals, the kind who never looked up unless you bumped their table. She didn't expect anyone to recognize her. Out of uniform, without her badge or service weapon, she was just another woman in her 50s with short-cropped, salt-and-pepper hair and soft lines under her eyes. But then something happened that made the air in the room shift. When it was finally her turn at the counter, the barista, young, no older than 22, blonde with a nose ring and a permanent smirk, didn't even look at her. Instead, she picked up her mobile phone and tapped a few times. Then, without lifting her eyes, she said, "We're not serving at the moment. Can you come back later?" Sharon blinked. "Excuse me?" The girl finally looked up. "We're a little backed up," she said, motioning toward the espresso machine where another barista was casually chatting with a customer rather than making drinks. "Maybe come back in 30? Behind Sharon, the line had grown. A white man in a business suit stepped forward and said, "Actually, I'm in a rush. Can I just get a black coffee?" To Sharon's surprise, the barista nodded. "Of course, sir," she said with a smile. He stepped around her. The barista rang him up, poured his coffee, and handed it to him within 20 seconds. Sharon didn't say a word. Not yet. She stood there, eyes fixed on the barista's face. "I'd like an Americano, tall." The girl sighed. "Ma'am, I told you, we're not serving right now. You'll need to leave." There was no anger in Sharon's eyes. No outrage. Just the quiet kind of disappointment that made people fidget under its weight. She didn't argue. She simply nodded, turned around, and walked out the same glass doors she had entered. Outside, the sky was still gray, but the wind had picked up. She walked to the end of the block, pulled out her phone, and made 2 calls, one to the Health and Safety Division and another to the Fire Marshal's office. Both answered on the first ring. "This is Chief Daniels," she said. "There's a cafe on High Street that I need you to visit. 7 Pines. I want a full inspection. Permits, safety compliance, fire code, health code, the works." She didn't explain. She didn't have to. Within 7 minutes, 2 unmarked cruisers and 1 white fire inspection van rolled quietly into High Street and parked just outside the cafe. Inside, the espresso machine kept hissing. Laughter and indie music filled the air. No one had noticed that the city had just arrived. Not yet. Inside 7 Pines Cafe, nothing seemed unusual yet. The baristas still moved lazily behind the counter, joking among themselves, half working as if the world couldn't possibly demand any urgency before 9 a.m. The playlist, some mellow acoustic cover of a Fleetwood Mac song, drifted through the air as customers typed on MacBooks or sipped lattes over unread newspapers. No one noticed the first city vehicle pull up. It was quiet, low-key, and parked at the corner. Then came the second, unmarked, dark gray, the kind of car you only recognize if you've worked in city government. Then a third vehicle, this one white with the city's fire marshal insignia on the side, parked right in front of the cafe's entrance. That's when people inside began to look up. It started with a flicker, someone glancing toward the door, confused by the sight of uniformed personnel stepping out, clipboards in hand, utility belts at their waists. Then came the whispers. Is something going on? Who are they? Health Department. 3 inspectors entered together. 2 men, 1 woman, all wearing official city ID lanyards and carrying notepads. They said nothing to the customers. They didn't need to. They walked straight to the counter where the same barista, Ashley, her name tag now clearly visible, was preparing a caramel latte. Ashley looked up. Hi? The lead inspector, a tall man with a stern face and sharp features, spoke clearly. We're here to perform a routine compliance inspection. Effective immediately, please halt all food and drink service. Ashley's mouth fell open. What? Right now? Yes, right now. She glanced over at her coworker, then looked around in panic as the other inspector began photographing the espresso machine, taking note of unsealed milk containers and a bin of uncovered pastries beside the counter. Customers were now fully alert. Some began packing up laptops, others pulled out phones and started filming. One older woman leaned over to her companion and whispered, I bet they had a rat. A manager finally emerged from the back, a man in his late 30s named Craig, hair slicked back, wearing a button-up shirt and a forced smile. Hi there, he said, approaching the inspectors. There must be some mistake. We haven't had any complaints. The fire marshal, a petite woman with a no-nonsense presence, stepped forward. Not a mistake. We're following up on a report submitted this morning. Full inspection, health code and fire code. Craig chuckled awkwardly. This is highly irregular. We've had these inspections scheduled for... Sir, she cut him off. Your back exit is locked from the outside. That's a fire code violation. Craig blinked. That's a security measure. It's illegal, she said, flipping a page on her clipboard, and it's the first of many violations I expect we'll find. Meanwhile, outside the cafe, Sharon Daniels stood quietly beside one of the cruisers, now wearing her uniform. Her badge caught the early sunlight as she scanned the sidewalk. No expression, no drama, just presence. Calm, powerful, and undeniable. A passerby recognized her and stopped. Chief Daniels, everything all right? She gave a small smile. Everything's being handled. Back inside, the inspection team was already uncovering more problems. Refrigerated goods stored at incorrect temperatures. No hand-washing log in the employee restroom. Expired dairy products. Pest control certificate not updated. Ashley stood frozen, eyes darting from inspector to inspector, then back toward the door. That's when she saw Sharon outside, in full uniform, with the badge, and a firearm at her side. Her face went pale. Oh my God, she muttered. That was her, Craig overheard. Who? The lady this morning, the one I told to leave. That was her. Craig's eyes widened. He turned toward the window and caught sight of Sharon, composed, patient, but unmistakably in control. He turned back toward Ashley, voice low and panicked. What did you say to her? I told her we weren't serving, Ashley stammered. She didn't look like she belonged here. One of the inspectors overheard. He raised an eyebrow but said nothing. His pen continued moving across the inspection checklist. Craig stepped toward the inspectors, his voice louder now. Listen, I understand you're doing your job, but this is a bit excessive. We've got customers here, and this is causing a scene. The fire marshal looked up. You're free to close voluntarily. Otherwise, we'll do it for you. Craig's shoulders slumped. Outside, Sharon turned and began walking slowly toward the cafe entrance. She moved with quiet authority. No need to rush, no need to make noise. When she stepped through the door, the room seemed to contract. Every head turned, conversations stopped. She walked up to the counter and stood next to the inspectors. Craig rushed forward. "Chief Daniels," he said, forcing a friendly tone. "Please, this isn't necessary. I had no idea you were—" Sharon raised one hand. "Don't." "Not here." He stopped mid-sentence. She turned toward Ashley. The young woman stood still, her lips pressed tightly together. "Was it you who told me to leave earlier?" Sharon asked calmly. Ashley hesitated, then nodded. I didn't know who you were." "That's the point," Sharon replied. "You shouldn't have to." Then she turned toward the inspectors. "Continue your work. Ensure everything is documented thoroughly." The lead inspector gave a nod. "Yes, Chief." Sharon turned back to Craig. "Until further notice, your cafe is under emergency suspension for health and fire code violations. You'll receive the official report by the end of the day. You may appeal." Craig opened his mouth to argue, then thought better of it. Sharon turned, gave one last glance around the room, and walked out as quietly as she came. Outside, people watched from across the street. A few clapped, others simply nodded. Inside, Seven Pines Cafe was silent, save for the scratch of pens and the click of camera shutters documenting every corner. Before that Thursday morning, Chief Sharon Daniels had never intended to make a spectacle of anything. Her reputation, built over 3 decades in law enforcement, was rooted in professionalism, quiet strength, and a rare ability to command a room without raising her voice. But the moment at the cafe had struck a different nerve. It wasn't just personal, it was symbolic, and it wasn't the first time. Sharon had grown up in Brookridge long before it became the polished city of tech startups and boutique coffee shops. She was raised in the South End, back when it was little more than a patchwork of forgotten lots, tight-knit families, and narrow-eyed shopkeepers who watched her mother with suspicion every time they walked into a store. Her mother, Lillian Daniels, had been a nurse. Sharp-witted and endlessly patient, she raised Sharon on principles so deeply ingrained that they felt like bone: dignity, pride, and never giving anyone an excuse to doubt your worth. "Baby," she'd say, adjusting the collar of Sharon's Sunday dress before church, "you gotta walk like you belong anywhere you stand, because you do." That lesson echoed through Sharon's entire life, especially during her first years on the force. When she joined the Brookridge Police Department in the late 90s, she was one of only 3 black officers in the entire city. She was met with skepticism, locker room jokes, and supervisors who told her outright she'd fit in better on dispatch. She stayed anyway. She passed every qualification, topped every written exam, and led the department in closed case rates for 5 years running. Still, the promotions came slow. When she was finally made lieutenant, it was after a white male colleague with half her experience was arrested for misconduct. No apology, no ceremony, just a stapled packet and a new badge number. By the time she reached the rank of captain, Sharon had learned how to outlast people who underestimated her. She didn't raise her voice, didn't throw her weight around, but she remembered every offhand remark, every sideways look, every time someone stepped ahead of her in a line they didn't earn. That's why, when she stood outside the coffee shop that morning watching the fire marshal do her job, she wasn't angry. She was clear. She wasn't just there for herself. She was there for every kid who'd ever been told they didn't look the part. Every woman who'd been asked, "Are you sure you belong here?" Every man who'd been followed around a store just for existing. Back inside the cafe, the inspectors were nearly finished. The list of violations had grown to 4 full pages. Improper food storage, blocked emergency exits, inadequate sanitation procedures, expired fire extinguisher certifications, and more damning still, a history of previous minor violations that had never been corrected. Craig, the manager, sat on a stool behind the counter now, his face pale and blank. The baristas whispered in the corner, their earlier confidence shattered. "What do you think's going to happen?" one of them asked. "She shut us down. Just like that. Do you think she's really the police chief? She walked in with half the city. What do you think? Craig rubbed his temples and looked at his phone. No response from the owner. Of course not. The owner, a venture capitalist named Elliot Rollins, lived 2 states away and had never set foot in the cafe. He liked the idea of community spaces, but not the people who made them run. The fire marshal approached Craig with the final form in hand. You'll need to have a certified electrician, a licensed contractor, and a health inspection clearance before you reopen, she said. Craig tried to speak, but she cut him off. And this isn't just a citation. You're being reported for operating without valid, updated permits. If we find that you misrepresented any documents in your last renewal, there may be criminal charges. He nodded mutely, sweat forming at his brow. Outside, Sharon leaned against the hood of the cruiser, her arms crossed. Her radio buzzed quietly with updates from the precinct. A sergeant checking in. A patrol car requesting backup on a domestic dispute. Life moved on. A young man approached her hesitantly. Tall, nervous, early 20s, with a backpack and a puzzled expression. "Excuse me, ma'am, Chief Daniels?" She turned, nodding. "Yes?" "I just wanted to say, I saw what happened earlier, with the girl at the counter. That was messed up. I didn't say anything. And I should have. I'm sorry." Sharon studied him for a moment. "What's your name?" Darren Holt. "You in school, Darren?" "Senior at Brookridge University. Urban planning." She nodded. "Good field. The city could use more planners who know how communities actually work." He smiled sheepishly. "I'll try to be one of them." Sharon extended her hand. He shook it. "Next time you see something like that," she said, "say something. Doesn't take a badge to stand up." He nodded. "Yes, ma'am." As he walked away, she glanced at the coffee shop again. The inspectors were stepping out, clipboards full. A city seal was now taped to the inside of the glass door, temporarily closed, code enforcement. Sharon didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply stood there, eyes steady, watching as justice, quiet and unapologetic, took shape without a siren or a spectacle. It wasn't about revenge, it was about the principle. The moment you forget that dignity belongs to everyone, you lose the right to pretend you represent this city. And Sharon Daniels? She remembered everything. The news broke before noon. First, it was a post on X, formerly Twitter. A blurry photo of Chief Sharon Daniels standing outside Seven Pines Cafe. Arms folded, uniform sharp, gaze fixed. The caption read, "They messed with the wrong one today. Refused to serve the police chief and got the whole cafe shut down. Brookridge ain't playing." Then came the local blogs. Justice brewed hot, Brookridge chief shuts down cafe after being denied service. Followed by a short write-up from Brookridge Now, the city's independent paper. By 1 p.m., the cafe's Yelp and Google pages were flooded with angry reviews and screenshots of health violations. Hashtags like "on Seven Pines shutdown" and "Shelter serve everyone" began trending locally. By late afternoon, regional news had picked it up, and not just for the scandal. People were sharing Sharon's name with reverence. Her photo was everywhere. Her quiet composure had turned into a statement. There was power in restraint, and justice didn't need a spectacle to be seen. Inside City Hall, Mayor Judith Allen read the news from her office window, sipping her tea as the light glinted off the dome across the courtyard. She smiled wryly and picked up the phone. "Get me Daniels." Sharon answered on the second ring. "Mayor." "Nice boots on the ground work today," the mayor said, voice half smirking. "It wasn't intentional." "I know, but effective. You made a point without giving a speech. Nicely done." "Not about points," Sharon replied. "It's about patterns. Still, if this ends up national, you'll be hearing from networks. They're already sniffing for interviews." "Let them sniff. I've got reports to write." They chuckled, old colleagues exchanging the kind of respect that came only with time and battles fought on both sides of a line. But not everyone took it as quietly. Craig, still reeling from the shutdown, sat in the back room of his now dark cafe with a laptop open and a half-drunk energy drink sweating beside it. He scrolled through hundreds of comments online, most of them damning. Glad someone finally shut that place down. Rude staff, overpriced lattes, and bad vibes. This happened to my cousin last month. She's black too. Same treatment. I was followed in there just for wearing a hoodie, not surprised. Craig rubbed his face. He'd always prided himself on being progressive. He donated to causes, hung a rainbow flag by the register, put a BLM sign in the window in 2020. But deep down, he knew, signs meant nothing if the culture was broken. He had hired people who looked the part but hadn't trained them to understand the mission behind the image. Ashley, now off her shift and sitting silently on her sofa in a tiny studio apartment, scrolled through the same storm. Her name hadn't been mentioned publicly, but she recognized herself in every comment about the barista or the blonde with the nose ring. She kept replaying the moment in her head, the calmness in Sharon's voice, the quiet disappointment. Ashley had never thought of herself as racist. She had black friends, she had voted for Obama, twice, but she'd made an assumption the moment Sharon walked through that door, and assumptions had consequences. She stared at her phone as a message from Craig lit up the screen. Need to talk tomorrow. Come in at 9. She didn't reply. Meanwhile, across town, Darren Holt, urban planning student, witness to the moment, sat at a small table in the student union, telling the story to anyone who would listen. You should have seen her, he said, leaning in, eyes wide. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't flash her badge. She just handled it. The others at the table, students of color, LGBTQ students, first-gen kids who'd all felt the sting of being made invisible, listened with rapt attention. Some nodded. One girl said, "That's the kind of power I want to have someday." Darren smiled. It wasn't even about her. That's what I liked most. It was like she was standing in the gap for all of us. Back at precinct headquarters, Sharon sat in her office, reviewing routine reports and sipping a now-cold coffee. A knock came at the door. It was Detective Marcus Hall, one of her most trusted team members. You good? He asked, stepping inside. She nodded. Better now. You lit the city on fire today, in a good way. I didn't light anything. I just walked in for coffee. He chuckled. Yeah, but the way you walked out? Legendary. She gave a rare smile. Marcus paused. You know, a lot of us needed that. Not just folks in the streets, folks in uniform too. She looked at him. For real, he continued. We walk into rooms all the time and get doubted, side-eyed, even when we wear the badge. You showed folks what standing tall looks like. Sharon leaned back in her chair, gazing out the window at the fading sun. I didn't do it to be seen, she said. I know, Marcus replied. That's why it worked. Outside, the streets of Brookridge moved on as they always did. Cars inching through lights, buses hissing at stops, the golden haze of a late-day sun settling over storefronts and rooftops. But something had shifted, not just in the cafe that got shut down, not just in the employees who now had to reckon with their actions. It had shifted in the quiet power of presence, the kind that walks in calmly, speaks firmly, and leaves without shouting, yet somehow echoes louder than a crowd. And that kind of power, it lingered. 3 days later, the windows of Seven Pines Cafe were still dark. The once bustling coffee shop on High Street, which had prided itself on being the heart of the Brookridge creative class, now sat silent. Its signature chalkboard sign, usually boasting cheeky quotes or seasonal specials, had been wiped clean. A city-issued notice remained taped to the door, closed until further notice, code enforcement pending. But the silence wasn't just inside the cafe, it rippled outward. City employees who once ordered their morning cortados there now crossed the street to indie coffee trucks. Students who used to study at its window seats chose library booths instead. And among the community, the story had turned from gossip to lesson. Inside City Hall, Mayor Allen leaned back in her leather chair as a local journalist wrapped up an interview. "So you're saying the shutdown wasn't politically motivated?" the reporter asked. "No," the mayor said flatly. "It was the result of multiple code violations. And frankly, the fact that those violations were discovered after a citizen, who also happens to be our chief of police, was mistreated. That's called accountability." The next day, Brookridge Weekly published the quote under the headline, "Mayor speaks, respect isn't optional." But while the city processed the fallout, Sharon Daniels had moved on. Not past it necessarily, but beyond it. Her days were back to the rhythm she'd long since mastered. Early morning briefings, community check-ins, reviewing internal affairs reports, no cameras, no interviews. She declined every media request, including national outlets that had reached out asking for exclusive sit-downs. It wasn't her style. Still, the story took on a life of its own. 1 week after the incident, the Brookridge Civil Rights Coalition hosted a town hall. Sharon was asked to speak, but instead, she attended quietly, sitting in the back. She watched as a young teacher recounted being passed over for a promotion, and a teenage boy described being tailed through a department store. Each story was different, but the thread was the same. "We want to be seen as we are," the teacher said, eyes bright with emotion, "not as who they assume we must be." Sharon understood that intimately. Later that night, as she walked alone through the quiet of downtown, she passed Seven Pines. She paused only briefly, eyes scanning the locked doors, the dim windows. She noticed a small bouquet of flowers tucked into the door handle, wrapped in brown paper. A handwritten note was attached. "To the chief who made silence speak. Thank you, no signature." She took a deep breath, then kept walking. Elsewhere in the city, things were changing. Craig, the cafe manager, had been replaced. The ownership group behind Seven Pines issued a public apology, along with a pledge to enact mandatory anti-bias training across all their establishments. It wasn't redemption, but it was a start. Ashley, the barista, never returned to the cafe. Instead, she enrolled in a local program for restorative justice, hoping to learn more about how assumptions shaped outcomes. It didn't excuse what happened, but facing it was a first step. As for Darren Holt, the student who had witnessed it all, he wrote about the incident in his graduate school application essay. He called it, "When Justice Wore a Windbreaker." The essay went viral within university admissions circles, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true, because it captured a moment when someone stood up by simply standing still. And the city of Brookridge? It remembered, not just the cafe, not just the shutdown, but the way it felt when power didn't come with anger, but with resolve, when someone refused to be made small, yet didn't shrink others in the process. Sharon never wanted to be a symbol. She only wanted her coffee. But in walking away with dignity and returning with justice, she gave people something more. Proof that even in the small, everyday places, in a cafe, in a line, in a moment, what we do still matters. And that sometimes the quietest actions speak loudest.